Roughly 1,000 years ago, Western Europeans began to revive long-dormant trade routes with the East, with Asia. The Europeans wanted luxury goods, especially pepper and spices, produced in South Asia, especially India and Indonesia. They also sought Chinese luxury goods, like silk. Western Europe's growing interest in and access to Asian luxury goods was prompted by, among other factors, a series of religious wars in the Near East called the Crusades that lasted for a few hundred years between roughly 1100 and 1300. Western Europeans eventually failed in their efforts to reconquer the Holy Land from the Muslims, but these wars, the Crusades, counterintuitively strengthened the connections between Italian, especially Venetian, and Muslim merchants, while at the same time introducing European consumers to a wider variety of Asian goods. European interest in the East was further stimulated by merchant travelers like the Venetian Marco Polo, who, in the late 1200s, returned from Asia with stories of the incredible wealth enjoyed in far-distant Chinese and Indian empires. Polo, in describing one Chinese city, wrote, "This city is on so vast a scale, and the great Khan's yearly revenues therefrom are so immense, that it is not easy to even put it in writing, and it seems past belief to one who merely hears it told." Over the next few centuries, Polo's stories about the East began to circulate across Europe, stimulating interest in these distant lands. Around 1400, the Portuguese, a people at the far western edge of the Eurasian continent, began exploring southwards along the West African coast. The Portuguese were, initially, in search of African gold, spices, and human beings, slaves. In the second half of the 1400s, however, they were increasingly interested in discovering a way to sail around Africa straight to India. They hoped to make direct access to the fabulous spice markets of Asia, described by Marco Polo. They succeeded at the very end of the century. The Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama sailed around Africa to India and returned home in 1499. The Portuguese now had direct access to the fabulous spice markets of India, allowing them to cut out their old competitors, the Venetians. In the 1500s, the Portuguese built an empire of trade that stretched across the Indian Ocean and brought them incredible wealth. Almost simultaneously, the Spanish kingdoms that bordered Portugal, such as Castile and Aragon, also sought to access the fabulously lucrative trade goods flowing westward from Asia. The Spanish, however, could not trade effectively in the eastern Mediterranean with the Muslim world because the Italian merchants of Genoa and Venice completely controlled trade in this region. They could not sail south along the African coast because this region was dominated by their competitors, the Portuguese. Instead, the Spanish sovereigns, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, funded a mission led by an Italian navigator from Genoa named Christopher Columbus to sail westward around the world to Asia. As Columbus described his idea in a letter to his patrons, Ferdinand and Isabella, quote, "You commanded that I should not go to the east by land, by which way it is customary to go, but by the route to the west, by which route we do not know for certain that anyone previously has passed." And by the way, if you're wondering about this, yes, Columbus did know the world was round, but then again, most educated Europeans did. The idea that medieval Europeans believed the earth was flat is a myth. Columbus, of course, never made it to Asia. The world was much bigger than he realized. Fortunately for Columbus and his men, he stumbled into the Caribbean, or West Indian islands of the Western Hemisphere. The native peoples that Columbus and his men encountered in the Caribbean islands, especially Hispaniola, the Taino, were for the most part friendly. Columbus concluded that they would make excellent servants. In other words, slaves.